All right, and next up we have Fiona Jamison. She's the CEO of Spring International, and she's going to talk about people analytics. And I'm super excited. We had our call to talk about whether she wanted to speak at the conference, and I was asking her to be a panelist, and we just talked for so long. I was like, no, you've got to come on. You've got to do a whole plenary yourself. So I'm super excited. I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that working? Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you, Lee. It was a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to get to talk about my passion, which is people analytics. This is a new conference for me, right? I wasn't aware of this organization, and so my background is in HR. I'm an IO psychologist by training. I love anything to do with human behavior. And so I get the pleasure of working at Spring International. And we've been around for 30 years. I've been with the company 20 years. And we do research, analytics, and consulting. And so the research part is we're gathering feedback from millions of employee voices every year. So we do large-scale employee satisfaction surveys, engagement, onboarding, exit, leadership development, M&A work, cultural assessments, all of the above. Ultimately means we're just doing a hell of a lot of listening. And we're very much a custom research house. So the research that we do is customized based on the client. So based on the industry, the type of employee, the nature of the work that they do. So it could be healthcare, manufacturing, biotech, retail, logistics, transportation. The one thing that makes them all the same is they all have humans working for them, humans that come with baggage and attitudes and behaviors and personalities and challenges and people issues. And so we're really that voice piece for them. So I thought what I'd share with you today is kind of what we're seeing in the field of people analytics, what we're learning from all the data that we're collecting. And hopefully some of it will resonate and it'll be somewhat helpful for you. So from our point of view, data is everywhere when it comes to people analytics. We're looking at all kinds of data, whether that's data in HRIS systems, data that we're observing, how employees operate or how they work, their attitudes, things that we're collecting in feedback surveys, qualitative data, quantitative data. All of that is information that can help our clients make better human capital decisions and be more strategic about the kinds of decisions they make with their people. What's interesting for me is every time I start work with a new client, I sit down with the leadership team and I try to get an understanding of where they are on this spectrum. A study was done a couple of years ago by the Harvard Business Review, and it put HR professionals and leaders into these three categories. You are either analytically savvy, which means you probably have some training, some comfort with data and analysis. You work with data on a regular basis and you interpret it to make decisions. Then there's analytically willing, which is a group that's kind of open-minded about it, or they're excited about it. They probably have no training, probably don't have their hands in data very often. And then we have this pleasurable group to work with occasionally, which is the analytically resistant. They're the ones that say, I know how it works. I've been in the industry for 30 years and I know how people operate. Yes, and I don't need data to help me with that decision making, right? So in the room, how many of you know you have some leaders who fall into analytically savvy? Most of you? Feel like you've got those? Okay. Anybody have some willing? Yeah. And people have analytically resistant? Everybody, right? They are the most challenging, but here's what I found. Working with analytically resistant, if they get on board and then they learn from the data and they make a better decision and they see better results, guess who become your biggest advocates? Because then they want to tell the world, look what I did, right? So we found that while analytically resistant at the beginning can be a challenge to get them bought in, to take them along the process, make sure they look in the open, the black box of the analysis that we're doing, those often end up being our biggest champions. We also know that organizations range in terms of their analytical maturity. And this is another thing that we'll do. We'll sit down and talk to them about where does the data sit in the organization? Who has access to it? How clean is it? What's the quality of that data? How often is it updated? Et cetera, et cetera. And we know that there's about 4 levels of organizations' maturity. We've got the reactive, who are, yeah, when the data tells us something, we will react to it. We have the proactive, right, which is we're actively looking at the data and looking at patterns and trends to make better decisions. We've got the strategic group, which is actually collecting new and different data to better understand the kinds of future decisions they're going to make. And then we have the truly integrated, predictive type of companies. Today, on a study we did across industries in the greater Philadelphia region, which is where we're based, we discovered there's only about 10% that sit in that currently fully integrated predictive stage right now. There's about 20% that fit in the strategic. I think it was about 30% that sat in the proactive, and the rest all sit in reactive. There's a lot of companies still in that sort of, well, we have siloed data, the data is not necessarily talking to one another, and we're kind of reacting to it versus being proactive. So when it comes to people analytics, which is the space that I live in, there's really a bunch of benefits to it. And this goes across industries for us. When done well, it can really improve your talent acquisition and your talent retention. Like knowing who you need in your organization ahead of time, how you can find them, how you can attract them to your brand, how you can engage them once they're on the job, and then how you retain that talent. And if you're using the right kinds of people analytics, it's really going to help you improve that experience. On the job employee experience, I'm sure pretty much all of you do some kind of annual employee engagement survey. Most companies doing those today? Yeah. Those done well, if they're analyzed well and they're looked at by level and by function and by role over time, you can also enhance the employee experience. Because we know if employees are having a good experience with you, they're less likely to leave, right? We've also found that it can improve leadership effectiveness. So for us, one of the biggest reasons, we do thousands of exit interviews a year, thousands of them. And we do them in manufacturing, logistics and transportation, retail and healthcare. That's where we're doing all our exit interviews. What do you think is the #1 reason why people leave companies today? Money? What else? My boss, my supervisor. Yep. Anything else? Don't feel valued. Okay. #1 reason today is my boss. Congrats, you win the prize. Bragging rights, that's all you get. #1 reason is that. #2 reason is growth and development. I do not see a role for myself in the future. You have not outlined the skills that I can continue to learn. This is especially true of anybody under the age of 35, right? So the next generation coming into the workforce that are looking for growth, that's their #1 reason for leaving. This is the first year where pay has actually shown up in the top 5 reasons. The first year. We've been doing this for decades, right? People today, and because we have a tight talent market, there are 2 jobs to every 1 employee today in the talent market. So if you're struggling to find someone, there's a reason for that. There aren't enough people. And not only that, people are moving around a lot more, and they're switching industries. They're not just switching companies, they're switching industries. So this whole idea of the great resignation, that's not what it was. It was the great rethink. People are switching careers. They're saying, I don't want what I had pre-pandemic. I want something new. I want something that's going to allow me to grow, allow me to have the flexibility that I want. You know, that commute that I used to have, that's not what I want anymore. In fact, interestingly, there was a study done by the Society of Human Resource Management earlier this year that looked at, it was a cohort study, a conjoint study that looked at the same job, one virtual and one in person. And what they found was, they layered on pay and benefits. What they found was for that same job, if you wanted that person to come in to a physical location, you'd have to pay them about 20% more in salary to come in. And that was only true if they had less than a 30-minute commute. Well, if you live in an urban area, right in a city, guess what? Everything's a 30-minute commute, right? If you're looking at like California, the big cities, Philadelphia, you can't get into the city in less than 30 minutes, unless you're already living in the city. If you live over a 30-minute commute, that 20% pay differential actually goes to 30%. And by the way, I want some additional benefits. I want on-site daycare. I want ability to go to the gym. I want something else above and beyond that. So we work with a lot of companies who've said, we want everybody to come back in and sit back in their desks, right? We're like, you can have that. You can make that happen if you really want to. But guess what? You're going to lose a proportion of your employees, or you're going to have to pay them more, or you're going to have to add benefits. Which one do you want? And then they're like, maybe virtual's okay, right? The other things that people analytics to do is can enhance systems and processes. It's a great way of also streamlining training and getting better understanding of the impact of the training and learning development that you're doing. This was a study done recently to say what are the most common types of people analytics projects that are happening. The number one and the easiest, the one most people care about, is predicting turnover. So actually looking at who's most likely to leave the organization and why. Followed up with like time to fill, cost per hiring, like how quickly can we get the talent that we need. Interestingly enough, from our data, time to fill positions has almost doubled in the last year. So people are having open positions for longer, which is causing burnout, right? Because people are saying, I'm in a department of 12, but there's only 10 of us, and now I'm doing, 1.25 of a job because I'm filling in that gap, and over time, that burns. Workforce planning is also very popular, things like succession planning, who's going into the next leadership roles. Not a lot of really good, sophisticated work going on in that area. And now we have the overlaid challenge of most companies are focusing on diversity and succession planning, and their current talent pools aren't diverse, so now they're trying to figure that out, right? So that's another key challenge that we're seeing. So what are the most common data sources? So from a people analytics point of view, a lot of companies are just focused in on HRIS data. So anything that's in their system about, how many men do we have? How many women do we have? How long have they been with us? What roles have they been in? How much are we paying them? What's the job architecture, right? A lot of the core information that's in your HR systems. We're also seeing a lot of companies looking at attitudinal data and then peripheral HR data. So how many learning hours do they do? How are they participating in health and wellness initiatives? What levels of mentoring and how many hours of mentoring and training are they receiving? How many people are calling out sick? How many people are on the road? And what proportion of their time are they on the road? And how far do they travel? Companies that are really sophisticated with people analytics are also tying in actual financial data, right? So customer data, profit, revenue, volume, output per square foot, output per employee, quality data, accident data, and they're connecting the dots. So things like answering key people questions like, are our more engaged employees also safer, right? Do we then therefore spend less money on, accidents and healthcare as a function of them being safer, right? Are our more engaged employees absent less often? Do they use our benefits more or less, right? And so how can we improve employee engagement? And the reason behind it is because we know it has an impact on the actual bottom line and the productivity of the organization. Here's the biggest challenge that most companies face. None of that data actually today speaks to one another. They're all in different systems, right? We've got our customer data over here, we've got our people data over here, and operational data in the middle. And it's not common that those data sets are talking to one another, or somebody has the digital skills to create the systems and infrastructure to make that happen. So what matters in the workplace today? So these are the issues that we have been talking about with clients in the last 18 months, and they are just top of their minds, right? The first one is most companies have moved beyond employee engagement, what makes a happy employee, right? It's about the entire employee life cycle. Everything from when the first time they look at your brand online to the first time they talk to a family member, what's it like to work there, to what was the application process like? What was the recruiting manager conversation like? What was my first day on the job? What was my 30 day on the job? When did I have my first interaction with my manager? How did that go? You know, how was my first performance management conversation? When did I get training? Who trained me? You know, all the way through to, nobody's talked to me about my career for the last 30 days, the last 60 days, the last 90 days. I'm out. And that's an interesting fact we discovered recently, is 80% of the exit interviews that we do that are based on growth and performance say no one in their immediate management talked to them about their growth and development within the last 90 days. So if you're not doing quarterly conversations with your employees, your valuable, talented ones that would be hard to replace, if you're not having quarterly conversations with them, in 90 days they're going, yeah, you don't care about my growth. 90 days, right? And what are most performance appraisal systems? Once a year if you're lucky. If you've got a good supervisor and a good manager, maybe they're saying to you, hey, what do you want to work on next? Yeah, let me learn that skill. So good leaders are good at having those regular conversations. Bad leaders or poor managers, oh, I'm going to talk to them about their career in December, right? Well, that's probably too late in today's talent market, because someone else is calling them. That's the other thing we've learned in the last year. Recruiters and headhunters, we're mostly used with top talent, right? Senior leaders, directors, maybe managers. Guess who recruiters are calling today? Frontline employees. They are looking your organization up and they're going, okay, you're a competitor to this person. I think it's something like 60% of the US workforce is on LinkedIn. Well, they just go to LinkedIn, they see where they work, they look at their title and they go, I'm going to reach out to them. I'll guarantee you most of your employees have been connected by a recruiter, had some kind of poke message to them in the last year about, have you thought about working somewhere else? Right, so if you're not having that conversation with your employees, somebody else is. The second that is a big topic is building diversity, equity, and inclusion. And most companies haven't ever, they've looked at that maybe from a compliance standpoint in terms of data, who do we have, how much, how many, but they haven't measured their attitudes and the experiences of those employees. That's what they're measuring today. Adapting to new technology. There's an awful lot of employees that through COVID were like, yep, try this new system. And they're kind of doing it, but they had no training necessarily. They're just kind of expected to get on board. And so a lot of companies are struggling with employees who are kind of falling behind. Manager and leadership development. Pre-COVID, there was a drop in investment in leadership development. Like leadership trainings was seen as a nice to have. And then during COVID, a lot of that went out the window because we were focused on getting stuff done, right? And just staying afloat. There is a huge reinvestment now in manager and leadership development because we know that's what helps us retain employees. Restoring well-being and the meaning of work. Anybody less than the age of 35 in our data, the mission and purpose and their connectivity to their company is really important in why they choose to work for you. My generation, 40s plus, it's a job, right? There wasn't as much of a connection with the company. Great if you had it, but it wasn't necessarily something you sought out when you were looking for an employer. But this younger generation, they want to feel like they're making an impact, that they're understanding their role in the organization and how they're contributing to society. And the last one, and this is a concern for a lot of our clients necessarily, is this increased labor activity. So the unions, which have been going down in membership in the last 20 or 30 years, right, are now super active, fighting for survival and going after employers actively to increase union membership. And if you want to maintain a direct relationship with your employees, this is a huge concern. If anybody's been watching the Starbucks issue, right, of they've got, I don't know, something like 13,000 locations or 9,000 locations, I forget the number, but something like 300 or 400 of them now have to be negotiated labor agreements. That's like most people's worst nightmare, right? To have a separate labor agreement for every single one of those locations and have to negotiate pay and wait, all of that. I mean, it's a nightmare. So a lot of organizations are coming to us now and saying, how can we prevent that? How can we proactively understand using data where we have risk so we can maintain that positive employee relations? So this is the process that we use when a customer or client comes to us and they says, all right, we've got a challenge, we've got to make a decision, we need to get better at something. We use this process to understand how do we move from data that they have to insights and making better decisions. So the first thing we do is we sit down with the leadership and we're like, what are you trying to accomplish? And what's your strategy? And what's your goal? Are you growing? Are you shrinking? Are you merging? Are you, developing new products? What's your kind of business strategy? Because sometimes they'll come to us with a question to use data, and it actually has nothing to do with the business. It's like, we just kind of want to know. We're like, well, that's great, right? We could do that, but that's really not a good way to spend your money. Let's make this analysis feed into your strategy. So once we figure out what the key questions are among the leadership team, then we go and evaluate their data. And we look at all of their data sources, who houses them, who owns them, what systems they're in, are the systems speaking to one another? We had a good example of this in one of our manufacturing clients, and they said, well, we have safety data. I said, okay, send it over. Let's have a look at it. And they said, well, we'll have Susie send you the spreadsheet. I said, okay. That was my first sense that this wasn't going to be good. And then, so I said, okay, and they sent it over, and it was every location by date with, number of accidents and level and severity, et cetera, and dollars associated to it. So I said to Susie, how does this get created? Because there was a lot of gaps in there and some numbers looked really off. And she said, well, such and such writes theirs on a form and then they send it to this person. She scans it in. It comes to my email. I manually put that into a spreadsheet. And then this department has a different spreadsheet. It's kind of a different format, but then I hand copy that over and paste it in. I was like, oh, I feel sick. So I said, okay, right, but this is the data that you need and you've been using. So, but the quality of that data was so bad. We said, you can't use this in any analysis. What you need to do is let's go back 3 paces and say, let's create a form that everybody uses. It goes into a central place. And then this data will be high enough quality for us to analyze. But there was sort of a garbage in, garbage out system going on. So once we've evaluated all that, we establish buy-in with the data owners. I have a great example of this with a long-term care facility where they had, like 500 locations nationwide, and all the data was owned in different departments. We said we'd like all the data owners to come to a room in the corporate office, and we're going to have a show and tell. You show me yours, I'll show you mine kind of exercise. So all the data owners came in. They had a little show and tell, each of them. It was the first time over half of the room had met the other half of the room. I was like, how does that happen? They'd all worked for the company at least 10 years, and being in that room together was the first time they'd actually been in that room. Not only that, they had created an incredible dashboard, right? And I said, this is amazing, it's beautiful. It had 256 variables in it. Wow, I was such a data geek with that, that's amazing. How long does it take you to do this? It takes 9 people 9 days to create this dashboard, a month. I said, okay, 9 people, 9 days, that's a lot of data. I said, how many people, who's using this dashboard? Silence. I said, who's using it? Who's leveraging it? Silence. I said, okay. We're going to park that question. I'm going to come back to you. We're going to take it offline. I come back to them afterwards and I said, is there a way for us to go back into the system and see who's opening the different things? Guess how many people? There's 13,000 people in this organization. 13,000 people across the nation, 300 locations. How many people were using this dashboard? 6? 9? Any other guesses? Yeah, 10. The 9 people who built it, and 1 senior leader. So I was like, who is it? Let me go call him. So I called the senior leader. I'm like, hey, I'm just calling because I heard you use this dashboard. Yes, I use it every month. What do you use it for? Well, I just look up this one number. And it was like a turnover number or something. And I said, how long does it take you? He says, well, I have to go back into my email, find the link to that thing, and then I click the link, and then I go to it, and then I go into this, and I pull that down, and I'm like, how about somebody email you that number on Fridays? Oh, we could do that? I'm like, yeah, we can do that, right? So, but what we ended up doing was we streamlined the database, figured out what data leaders actually needed, restructured it, gave them access just to that point in the dashboard so that they could, and then train them on how to use it. So they were kind of 75% of the way there. They just hadn't gone to that next stage where they've made it usable and accessible. The next part that we typically do is sit down and create like a human capital analytics strategy. What are the questions as a business do we need to answer in terms of people and talent? And we find that writing it down forces them to focus and stops them from going down rabbit holes that are not part of the strategy. That's not part of the strategy, this is where we're focusing. We'll then spend some time assessing capabilities in-house, because my company kind of operates like an ad hoc research department. We're analysts, researchers, programmers, developers, right? So we can come and sit and do it, but ultimately our goal is to teach them how to fish. Right, so we're assessing their capabilities. Who do you have in the organization today who understands data, who can develop insights, who knows how to build data infrastructure? Where do they sit and how do they operate? Then we'll either help them build the capability or we'll do the work. We're running the models, integrating data, answering the data questions, and then perhaps the most important part is that sharing of insights. And this is where we really leverage data visualizations, because we've learned over time that coming back with a 20-page report of numbers is not going to make any decision. If we can't fit it on one slide with evidence, insight, and a recommendation, it's not going to change behavior, right? So we use a lot of data visualizations to communicate the insights, not just back to senior leaders, but to employees themselves. And that's critical. If we don't get that sharing the insights bit right, action never happens, and the rest of this time was a complete waste. I sit on a people analytics committee at Wharton Business School in Philly, and it's with a bunch of people who love people analytics. And I asked the question in the last session, how much time do your teams spend on these different phases, like data cleaning, whatever, integration, sharing insights? The average answer was 80% of their time today is still spent cleaning and evaluating data. And about 20% is on the actual modeling and insights. I'm hoping that's going to change as people get better at data collection and analysis. So I'm going to share a couple of case studies in these areas, using different techniques, and kind of talk about the kinds of analysis that we do. So I sort of already mentioned this, but one of the questions we're getting a lot is, where is our labor risk? And so, as a leader, it's going to make me a better leader if I know, where I need to put my resources. Most companies that from an HR or employee relations standpoint have one or two people who focus in on that, but they have thousands of employees. Where do they spend their time, and how do they prioritize their most at-risk locations? So here's an example of a large healthcare employer. We had spent time with them trying to understand. They had a team of 2 employee relations professionals, and they were like, we've got so many sites, we don't know where to go, what to do. We know we've got issues, but we don't know where. And proactively, we don't know how to figure out what sites to go to. So we had mostly operational data. We had the percentage of call-outs, so when nurses and people would call out sick. The workload, so what proportion of their hours versus overtime they had. We had percentage of time they spent in their home department. So nurses are usually assigned to a certain department, but then they're pulled into other departments as the need arises. But they're more effective when they're in their home department where they know what they're doing and they have a same supervisor, et cetera. OSHA events. Employee relations events, which is like calls into the hotline, right? It's a hot mess in here today, and they've called it in. Shift overtime usage, voluntary turnover, PTO denial. During COVID especially, people's paid time off was getting denied. We need you, we need bodies here. That's why if you go to a hospital today, a lot of nurses are really burnt out, right? Because they didn't get their PTO. So that's a percentage we could look at by department. And then we know the manager tenure impacts how engaged employees are. The longer the manager tenure, the stronger the relationship, the more engaged they typically are. At least that's what the data tells us. So we pulled all this together, built it into a dashboard. We use Tableau for their dashboard. Their data feeds once a month, and it gets updated. We also overlaid external data, environmental data to this. So looking at number of petitions that have been submitted by the unions, number of unfair labor practices. This is all data that's accessible through the Department of Labor. And so you could have like a high risk department in a low risk area, right? In the middle of Kentucky, where there's no unions, there's no activity, there's no local campaigns, etc. Right? That would be lower risk than somewhere down in Philly, where there's also 3 unions down the street and there's another petition going on next door. Right? So we overlaid this data and created this risk scorecard. They're currently in the process of adding in, or we're trying to weave in their employee survey data too to this system, but that's obviously only a once a year data capture, which isn't as valid as this kind of predictive patterns. And what we're looking for, we have certain levels at which if accidents are going up, right, it hits a red flag. So we created a heat map. Now the employee relations team looks at this and says, I've got 3 hotspots, that's where I'm spending my week, right? Another question that we're getting, leaders want to know, how inclusive is our organization, right? To what extent do employees feel they can be themselves, that they belong, because we know that that helps to retain talent, helps reduce turnover, and also makes employees more productive if they feel like they belong, if they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. So this was a large transportation employer, and in this case we were using both qualitative and quantitative data. We started off with a lot of analysis of feedback groups and working sessions. We spent time with the leaders, and we basically went through this whole process of understanding what the employee experience was. They created a diversity committee, they were involved, they developed advocates. This is a particularly hard to reach population. We're talking train drivers, bus drivers, nobody that's sitting in front of a computer, right? Which makes employee feedback really challenging because they're not sitting in front, they don't have email. We ended up with something like an 80% response rate on the diversity assessment feedback. It was because we sent postcards to home. We did text messages to the mobile phones that they had, which they were already receiving messages from the company on. Supervisor call-outs, kiosks and codes, like QR codes. And interestingly, maybe positive or not positive, they also were running COVID vaccination events, right, during the time when they were doing their DEI work. And so we had people actually go to the vaccination events, and while people were standing in line, hey, take a survey, right? So multifaceted, multi-touch point to get to that level of response. Once the data came in, we ran the analysis by every demographic: age, gender, ethnicity, veteran status, disability, tenure, level in the organization, and we're able to identify about 10 areas that were potentially a real challenge. And now they're in the process, they've established the priorities, they've created a strategic plan, and now there's follow-up on each of those priority areas. But what's interesting, before they started work with the leadership sessions, we had them predict the kinds of things they thought they're going to need to do in the organization. Oh, we're going to need to develop more leaders, we need a women's mentoring program, we need X, we need Y, right? This was their estimation. We said, we're just going to keep this until we've actually done the assessment, then we're going to compare and see how close you were. Because we weren't sure they were really in tune with the employees. Completely different list. Completely different list. What they thought they did really well, they actually did horrible at, right? What they actually thought were gaps, they were already, I think, overly aware and conscious in doing it. And women in leadership was one of the components where they thought they really needed to do more, and they were already doing more than enough. But I think it really helped to have the kind of perception versus reality exercise built into the analytics process, so that they could see that the gut feel wasn't actually reflective of what their employee base thought. This perhaps was one of the most common types of people analytics that we see happening. Who's most likely to leave? Is perhaps one of the most common types of analysis that we get asked to do, and especially today. So this was another healthcare, but we've replicated this in various environments, manufacturing, especially food manufacturing, some chemical companies. And the process is basically the same. So we'll leverage what data sources exist, and we'll look at HRIS data, employee feedback data, voluntary turnover rates, shift, location, volume, leadership data, whatever we can get our hands on, and build a model that looks at, typically over time, like who left and what was their pattern of behavior before they left. Right? So in this case, we had 3 years of data, so we knew what role they started in, where they ended up each year, what their engagement scores were each year, what shifts they'd worked, how much overtime they'd had, etc. And we were able to look at those who'd left and said, okay, what was the profile of those who left versus those who stayed? And we were able to predict the next 100 people to leave. So based on that formula, we said, okay, we have 9,000. Here's the next 100 we think are most likely to leave, and here's the next 500 we think may leave in the next year if something doesn't change. Which they were. Now we're not allowed to tell individuals, right, because it's confidential data. But we were able to say this group, this shift, this department, this role, this function, this shift, right? So we were able to point them in the right direction. They then went out and did stay interviews with those top 100. Based on department and function. And in every single interview, they heard things like, how did you know? Like, this is like perfect timing. I was considering leaving. So the attitudinal behavioral data from the last 3 years was actually a very strong predictor of who was most likely to leave. And they were able to kind of get ahead of it, have some of those conversations. Now, some people still left. Right, because their reason for leaving was kind of external to the company, like I'm going back to school, or my partner or spouse is moving to a different city, and so there's always some of that in the data. But I think if you have top talent that you know it's going to be hard to replace, and if you're not proactively doing the career development conversations, the engagement, and mission alignment kind of work, this is an analysis I think can be really helpful. And for the data geeks out there, we use a variation of different model types. We tried it in R, Python, we use SPSS, AMOS, different modeling types until we get to kind of the best fit. And my team is a bunch of geeks, and they'll try every which way to figure things out. So it really depends on the volume of data, the nature of the data, to which platform we may use. The nice thing about most of these is because if you're using HR data, you can actually assign a cost to it too. Like the cost of the salary in replacing this person is X. So if we save these 100 people, we're saving X million dollars, whatever, for the company. And we always try to make that connectivity to the business bottom line to establish buy-in and ROI of whatever effort comes out of this kind of analysis. This is perhaps one of my favorite questions we get a leader is, we're about to spend X million dollars on training, and we don't know, is it going to be worth it? Or are we going to see a return on investment for it? So we get this question a lot. And this next case study is interesting because we actually had the ideal scenario for analysis. So this was an organization who had put half of their managers through training and half they hadn't. It's like the perfect experimental design. Right? We've got the control group that have been through the training and the group that hadn't. They said to us, we're about to spend this money and we don't know if it's worth it. We don't know if what we've already done has had any impact or not. The beauty for us was, well, we could compare the two. So we culled a bunch of data from them. Everything from store performance, profitability, customer satisfaction, turnover, leadership development hours. We even looked at the maturity of the store, because it was a retail environment, how many years the store had been open, when was the last time they went through refurb, We also took note of, because we were looking at a point in time, we removed any stores from the location that had gone through a massive weather event, because if they go through like a tornado or something, it throws the volume of the sales off. They're like outliers. So we did take a couple of stores out. We looked at invoice to employee ratio, accidents, all the variables we had. What we found was, gratefully, the leaders who had gone through the training actually had much higher engagement scores compared to those that hadn't. They had higher customer satisfaction scores. Their customers had a higher average ticket. They had less turnover and overall higher sales and revenue. So we calculated out the difference by the stores of the actual revenue within a 6-month period from the training, and then the savings that they would make and the profitability, the amount it would increase, was something like $10 million for this proportion of the business we were looking at. The training was going to cost them like $2 million. So we're like, okay, do you spend 2 to get 10? Yes. Right? So ultimately, the analysis led to a better understanding of the return on investment. Leaders actually loved the training too, but the stores improved in terms of their profitability. Now, they could have just gone and spent that $2 million, right? But this allowed them to actually determine what other things they could do. And given that kind of an increase, they also wanted to do refresher trainings for those managers to maintain and create sustainability over time. But I think it was a really interesting way. And we use structural equation modeling for this. And so, again, the technique and analysis is slightly different, but it's helping to answer business questions based on the actual bottom line. So, how am I doing for time? In terms of what's important to remember, so we spend a lot of time training HR people on analysis, because most people join HR because they love people. They want to be a people person. They want to spend time with people. Then they're in the job about 3 months and they realize they hate people, right? And why did I get into this job? And they try and spend as little time with people as they can. But typically they don't get into HR because they love math or numbers or analytics, right? It's not really in their wheelhouse. It's not their comfort level. So we're spending a lot of time getting HR professionals up to speed and comfortable with data and analytics and what is statistically significant and what is valid data and how do we interpret and how do we generate insights. And part of it is transitioning them from HR metrics to HR analysis, right? Metrics being how much, how many, counting stuff, and then, analysis being answering real business questions to get insights. We also have to encourage them that the data is just the data, and without us, we have to create the meaning, right? Because a lot of people, especially when AI started to be used in talent acquisition and recruitment, thought that their jobs were going to disappear. Now you're going to use a computer to figure out who the best hire is. Now you're going to use them to review the resumes. My role is diminishing. What am I there for? And so there's a lot of, actually, that stuff's great, but you still need a set of eyes. You still need knowledge and understanding and experience to put the context around this. So we're teaching them about the importance of putting context and experience behind the data analysis to get across your point. And the last thing that we're training them on is critical thinking is key. We're challenging them to challenge the data, right? Is that true? What is the context? Why do the numbers look like that? Can we validate this in some way? How can we bring this data to light? How can we test it in another part of the organization, right? So not to take data at face value. We had an assessment that a company had done in-house where they figured out the people, I forget what it was, but it was something like the people who were most disengaged were the people who had the longest commute. And it was like they had looked at only 3 pieces of data and they had forgotten to take into consideration role and tenure and all these other things. And there were certain roles that actually had nothing to do with the commute that caused them to fall into this bucket, but no one challenged it, and they started making all these decisions about, well, we got to get people to move closer to the office. No, that's not what you do. You fix the role, not the. So we have to get them to the point where they can challenge the data and really critically think about what it's telling you. And so, I leave this with the leaders that I work with is how can they leverage data in their decision making? How can they move away from that gut feel, looking at stuff and saying, that's just my decision? And how you approach your data with a clear question. One of the biggest challenges that most companies have is we've got so much information, we don't know what to do with it, right? We don't know how to approach this. And so we'll say to them, you've got to think about what is your business strategy? What are the questions that are going to feed in that? Let's go at your data with a very clear question and then build the analysis around that. Use your experience and knowledge to provide the context. And then when using data, we have a whole workshop that we do about influencing others with data and how to do that in such a way that you get them excited and on board with you and then ready to run forward, as opposed to analysis paralysis. Has anybody ever been in a meeting where you've just seen nothing but data and then everybody sits there and challenges the data? Yeah, it's because it's too much information. So we use this method of evidence, insight, and recommendation, which is a formula for, state your challenge, put the evidence in that helps you to answer it, what's the insight you generated, and then what's your recommendation. Because in that simple formula, you're moving them through the data, getting them to what next, versus spending all your time sharing all the evidence, right? So those are the kind of keys that we have. What I think is interesting, and I was listening to your talk about digital skills, in the people analytics space, there's typically 4 roles that we talk about that are key to building this in-house. One is your data scientist, right? The person who needs to be building the data infrastructure. One is the workforce scientist, this person who understands the structure of the organization and how people operate in it. They're more kind of a social scientist, business background. We have the IO psychologist, which is who understands how to measure things about people, so how you structure surveys, how you structure your research questions. And then the 4th person that we think is absolutely critical is the purple unicorn, right? Is the person who, we call them the interpreter or the translator. They're the person who understands what those other 3 roles do, but their skill sits on top of them and is the person who translates really complex findings in useful ways. They're also really strong in change management, collaboration, and team building, right? So that's where we're trying to push and position HR folks, get them comfortable with the data enough to know how to leverage it, but then give them the skills to be the translators, give them the skills to take people from data to action, right? From insight to recommendation. And I think as companies, so you may need more than 4 people, but a good people analytics department will have those 4 kinds of roles. Depending on the size of your organization, they could be an actual department. We've also seen structures where they use volunteers on special projects who are just excited to be data geeky, and they spend a portion of their time working on people analytics projects. So we've seen it work both ways, sort of in matrix organizations where they're spread out, and then we've seen others where there's a focus core, like center of excellence. And I think it'll be interesting to see over time how this pays out. And then I guess there's a 3rd model, which is companies like ours that sit outside the organization, that are little knowledge bases that they tap into as and when. So that's it, really. I'm like the caboose of the presentation, so I don't know. I appreciate you all hanging around. I'm happy to answer questions though.
I'll take the moderator Q&A.
Yeah, sure.
All right, well, thank you so much. It was just really packed with a lot of insights and wisdom. Before I open up to the floor, it reminds me your last point about this, you said purple unicorn?
Purple unicorn.
Purple unicorn, right? So we yesterday we presented, 2 colleagues and Goodyear folks presented the Data Analytics Champion Program. And, throughout the design of the program, the purpose of the program was how to design a program that will help people to use data not only to gain insight, but not only also take action themselves, but primary goal is to compel others to act, right? And creating a condition for people to change their behaviors in a way so that the organization can move into other direction or and so forth. So it's amazing. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yep.
Any questions? We have few minutes before we move on to the final. Yes, please.
My question is about specifically the example you gave of having a lot of data, a lot of people preparing it to find out that only one piece of data is used by one person. Is it pretty common in your work and experience to have that type of scenario, right? Where there's just a lot of data out there, and then you're able to streamline it. Or would you say that more generally, the data is valid, it's just not used properly?
I think it varies on the age and maturity of the organization and their stage in their development. So for example, in the biotech space, pharmaceuticals, we see a lot of new organizations who just simply don't have the infrastructure. They're collecting data, but they haven't created anything with it. With older legacy companies that have been around for 30, 40, 50 years, they have grown so much and they've built up so much kind of data knowledge that there's just too much, and now they're collecting a lot of it based on, well, we've always collected it, so we're going to keep collecting it. And they almost need to go through a good data blueprinting exercise will identify what you need to keep and what you can let go of. Because over time, we're like, well, we want to measure this because of this project, and then we just keep measuring it. Whereas, the validity of that or the usefulness of that may have diminished over time, but we're still spending time and energy collecting it. Back to, I forget whose presentation it was, with the green curve and the red curve. Like, there's a lot that's happening in that red curve around just data collection that is no longer useful. And so I think the older organizations, larger ones, tend to fall into that. We just collect it.
From Owens Corning. So as you're talking about data, and I really resonated with the example of like the 9 people in 9 days to collect data. One of the problems that we see is as we streamline some of those processes, the people who were engaged in collecting, looking at that data, cleaning it up and contextualizing it, also tend to be the data owners. Like, they're the ones who really should be reviewing and looking at it. And when we streamline some of those processes, they don't take as much ownership in looking at the data, reviewing it on a regular basis, and staying engaged with what it says. So have you experienced that in the work that you've done, and how do you keep people engaged in looking at and finding insights when they're no longer really owning the process of streamlining it?
Yeah. And I think that's where the retraining comes in and the retooling, right? It's, you need to retrain those data managers, let's call them, into data influencers, right? It's where you give them the skills to now it's your job to take the insights as developed from this said dashboard and share that with leadership, and then get leadership aligned with it. So it's about, and that's exactly what happened with that group. There were about 5 people who went, like, now what, right? And so we actually created an influx system for them, where it was simple. I say influx system, that makes it sound fancy. An inbox in email, right, where people could submit data requests to run analysis. So they shifted from data formulation to actually answering requests that business leaders had. So it was sort of retooling them and repurposing them so they were actually answering business questions. The perceived value of that group went up tremendously amongst leaders, because now they were seen as a source of insights and interpretation versus just report delivery people. So, but that took a little bit of confidence building and training on what their new role could be. We had them go and do lunch and learns throughout the organization, so that they would go to different departments and say, hey, this is the data we have access to. We're available for answering questions. Here's a couple of the questions we've been asked, and here's the answers we got. So they kind of did almost like a little roadshow of who they were and what data they had access to, and that built their confidence. It exposed the rest of the organization to them and their skills. And I think created visibility to now there was a resource of people who could answer insights versus just send me a turnover report, right? So.
All right. Do we have any other questions, comments? Well, thank you,
Thank
Fiona.
you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.